My name wasn't just missing from the memorial list that morning. It had been removed. On purpose. The wind off the Virginia Beach shoreline cut straight through the parking lot, sharp enough to make people pull their coats tighter as they moved toward the hall. I stood in line with everyone else, hands in my coat pockets, already knowing what was about to happen, but still hoping, in a quiet, stubborn way, that I might be wrong. The petty officer at the check-in table looked young, polite, and completely unprepared for anything outside routine. He scanned his tablet once, then again, slower the second time. His smile stayed, but it shifted just enough to signal a problem he didn't want to own. "I'm not seeing your name here, ma'am." He angled the screen toward me, like I might recognize something he didn't. I didn't look. I didn't need to. The printed clipboard beside him was clearer anyway. Family access list. Names clean, aligned, organized. And at the bottom, in ink that hadn't fully settled into the paper, was a signature I recognized immediately. Daniel Reid. My brother had always liked order. That morning, he arranged me right out of the room. I stayed still long enough for the people behind me to notice. A man shifted his weight. Someone behind him let out a quiet breath that wasn't meant to be heard, but always is. The line slowed. That was all it took for a volunteer to step in. She was older, composed, the kind of person who managed situations without ever raising her voice. If your family expected you, your name would be listed. She said it gently, but not kindly. There's a difference. The man behind me leaned slightly to see past my shoulder, already deciding what kind of mistake I had made. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong person. Another family issue. I stepped out of line without arguing, not because I agreed, but because I understood exactly how this would look from the outside. I followed the volunteer's glance toward the entrance just in time to see them. My mother adjusting the front of Daniel's uniform, smoothing it with the kind of care she had never needed to explain. My father walking beside them, posture straight, already part of something structured and visible. Daniel saw me. It wasn't a long look. It didn't need to be. Just enough to confirm I was there. Then he looked past me, like I was part of the parking lot. No pause, no signal, no correction. They kept walking. That was the part that settled it. Not the missing name, not the polite rejection at the table. The ease of it. The way everything continued as if nothing had gone wrong. The worst part wasn't being left off a list. It was watching everyone act like that made perfect sense. Apparently, blood only counted if it came with the right seating arrangement. I could have left. That would have been the reasonable choice. Avoid the moment, avoid the looks, avoid standing there like a problem no one wanted to claim. But I didn't move. I stepped to the side instead, just far enough out of the way to let the line continue, exactly where people like me were expected to stand when we complicated things. Because I knew something they didn't. Or maybe I knew something they hadn't fully thought through. This morning wasn't just a memorial, and I wasn't here just because of family. I watched the doors open and close, people moving in and out of a version of the day that had already decided I didn't belong in it. I let the silence settle, let the discomfort turn into something steadier. If they were going to go this far, I wanted to see how far they were willing to take it. A few minutes later, a staff member stepped out from inside, scanning the check-in area with quiet urgency. He leaned toward the petty officer and spoke low, but not low enough. "Has Reid checked in yet?" General Holt is asking. The petty officer looked down at the list again. He shook his head. I was still standing right there. This is a fictional story. All characters and events are not real. My name is Lennox Reid. I am 26 years old, and most people who meet me for the first time assume I do some kind of office work that could be explained in one sentence and forgotten just as quickly. I am a civilian intelligence specialist assigned to a joint threat analysis cell, working on assessments that shape movement, timing, and risk for expeditionary planning along the East Coast. I do not wear a uniform. I do not stand in formation. I do not speak unless I need to, mostly because I learned early that the more I explained, the easier it became for people to reduce what I was saying into something smaller. I am quick in ways that are not visible, and quiet in ways that people mistake for absence. My brother, Daniel Reid, is the opposite of that, in almost every way that matters to a room. He is a Marine officer with a career that looks exactly the way people expect it to look. Clean record, clear progression, the kind of presence that fills space without effort. He speaks in complete sentences, knows where to stand, when to nod, and how to keep everything within what he calls appropriate. That word does a lot of work for him. It is how he explains decisions that leave people out without ever sounding like he meant to. Our mother, Paula Reid, does not raise her voice. She does not need to. She smooths things over, adjusts details, and turns exclusion into something that looks like order. She can make a person disappear from a situation while smiling the entire time. Our father, Frank Reid, spent years in the military, and he still measures value by what he can see. Uniforms, ceremonies, lines of people standing in the right place. Things that can be pointed to and recognized without explanation. Work that happens in rooms without windows does not fit easily into that system. And then there is Major General Holt, the one man connected to that morning who does not waste words. When he asks a question, people answer it, or they feel the absence of an answer immediately. Daniel did not remove me from the command list. He did not have that authority. What he did have was control over the family access list for the memorial, the part of the day that was visible, the part that would be remembered in photographs. That is where my name was erased. At the same time, in a different room behind that ceremony, my name was already expected for a closed session tied to the same event. That is the difference no one outside the system sees until it is too late. By 26, I had already learned that some rooms do not ignore you because you are small. They ignore you because they would have to rearrange themselves if they admitted you mattered. Have you ever watched a family protect the person who looked right for the photo, not the one carrying the weight? What happened at the memorial that morning did not begin at the check-in table. It had been building for years, in ways that were small enough to ignore, but consistent enough to shape everything. In my family, we were always introduced as a matched set that never quite matched. Daniel was presented in full detail every time. His rank, his role, his path, all of it delivered clearly and with a kind of pride that filled the room before he even spoke. When it came to me, the sentences were shorter and softer. She does analysis. She works in an office. Something with data. My mother would usually follow it with a gentle correction that was not really a correction at all. Daniel serves. Lennox supports. It sounded balanced if you did not listen closely. My father preferred things he could point to without explanation. Uniforms, insignia, formations, visible proof that something real had been done. The kind of work that happened in secure rooms without windows did not translate well into that language, so he reshaped it into something that did. He would call it consulting around the military, as if it existed somewhere near the real thing, but not quite inside it. None of this happened in a single moment. It was a pattern that repeated until it became normal. I remember a dinner where Daniel talked through a deployment timeline, and everyone listened, leaning in, asking questions, giving him the space to finish every thought. When I tried to explain a risk factor that had delayed a similar movement, my mother smiled and cut in before I could get past the first sentence, redirecting the table back to something lighter. Let us not make dinner complicated. Another time, during a holiday gathering, someone asked what I actually did. Before I could answer, Daniel stepped in with an easy summary that made it sound smaller, simpler, easier to move past. Something with reports. It was always something like that. clean, polite, and wrong in a way that was hard to correct without looking like I was the one making things uncomfortable. If I pushed, it became a problem. Do not turn this into one of your briefings. Your brother is the one actually in it. That was the line that settled most conversations. Not said with anger, just with certainty. Over time, I stopped correcting them. Not because I agreed, but because I understood the pattern. The more I explained, the more they reshaped it into something that fit their version of me. The silence became easier to carry than the effort of being misunderstood on purpose. Some families never throw you out. They just keep teaching you how little space you are allowed to take. Being tolerated for years can do more damage than one loud fight. I was not hated. That would have been clearer. I was reduced, consistently and politely, until there was almost nothing left for them to question. That was the ground everything else stood on. Daniel did not think he was cruel. That was the useful part. Men like that can do a lot of damage while feeling perfectly reasonable. If someone kept reducing your life with little, polished comments, how long would it take before silence felt safer? Standing off to the side of the entrance, watching people move inside without hesitation, it became impossible to pretend this was an oversight. It had shape to it. It had intent. And a few days earlier, I had already seen the moment it was decided. Daniel had been speaking with a civilian event coordinator, someone responsible for organizing the attendance flow between command guests and family members. It was a simple exchange on the surface: names, confirmations, numbers, the kind of conversation that usually passes without meaning anything more than logistics. The coordinator had glanced at a list and asked a routine question. "Do you have a sister attending as well?" Daniel did not hesitate. "No, keep it to immediate family attending with command." It sounded clean, efficient, reasonable to anyone who did not know what he was leaving out. The coordinator paused for a second, looking back at the list. "Same last name, just confirming." Daniel adjusted his posture slightly, still calm, still controlled. "She won't be part of the service." My mother was standing beside him when he said it. She did not interrupt. She did not correct. She did not even look not correct. She did not even look surprised. If anything, she leaned into the moment with the kind of quiet agreement she had practiced for years. It would only complicate the morning. She said it softly, like she was smoothing something out rather than removing someone entirely. My father stood a few steps back, saying nothing, which in our family had always counted as agreement. That was the decision. Not forgotten, not overlooked. Discussed, shaped, and finalized, in a tone that made it sound like the most natural choice in the world. Back in the present, I watched as that decision played out exactly the way they had planned it. People walked past me without question, guided by a list that had already decided who belonged. A man I recognized from previous gatherings slowed when he saw me standing outside the entrance. He looked confused for a moment, then settled on an explanation that made more sense to him than the truth. "Oh, I thought she moved away." He said it casually, not to me, but to Daniel as he approached the doors. Daniel heard him. He nodded slightly, just enough to acknowledge the comment, not enough to correct it. My mother did not say anything. My father did not say anything. The version of me they had agreed on held. I was not late. I was not missing. I had been removed from the story they were presenting to everyone else. That was the part that stayed with me. It was not just about being kept out of the building. It was about being erased from the version of the family they chose to show in public. Nothing says respect for the fallen like rearranging your own family to make the seating cleaner. My mother could make cruelty look like event management, and that morning she did it without raising her voice once. The pattern was complete. There had been a conversation, there had been agreement, there had been silence where there should have been correction. And now there was a room full of people who believed I did not belong there because 3 people had decided I should not. The question was not whether Daniel knew what he was doing. It was how far he believed he could take it without consequence. What he thought would happen if I stepped inside anyway. Whether he had any idea what the rest of the morning actually required. A few minutes later, the door opened again and an aide moved quickly toward the check-in table, his voice low but direct. "Do we have Ms. Reid for the review room yet?" The petty officer checked the list again, slower this time, as if the answer might change. He shook his head. I stayed where I was and said nothing. By then, it was becoming clear. They had removed the one person the room inside was already waiting for. What cuts deeper to you? Being left out once, or realizing 3 people had to agree before it could happen? I did not need to raise my voice to know how this would unfold. I never had. The kind of work I do does not happen in places where anyone is watching, and it does not come with moments that look impressive from the outside. I do not step onto fields, I do not stand in rows, and I do not speak into rooms unless there is a reason for people to listen. Most of what I do happens in rooms without windows, where time feels different and decisions carry weight long after the conversation ends. I read patterns that other people would rather ignore, and I say things that are rarely comfortable, but often necessary. That is the part people never see. It is easier to call it paperwork than to understand what it actually holds. That morning, while I stood outside a room I had been deliberately kept out of, I already knew what was happening behind the walls and what would happen next. The memorial was only the visible part. The real reason people had gathered there did not end with a ceremony. There was a closed review scheduled immediately after, and I knew exactly what would be discussed. I knew who had pushed for a revision in August, and why that revision had mattered more than it looked at the time. I had seen the movement timeline shift, not because someone made a public call, but because the assessment behind it had forced that change. My phone vibrated once in my pocket, a secure alert that most people would never recognize. It was a small update, a change in arrival timing, confirming that Major General Holt was already on site and moving according to a tighter schedule than expected. That detail mattered, because the review could not begin properly without the analyst assigned to it. And that analyst was me. I did not need to announce that. I did not need to prove it to the people walking past me into the hall. The system already knew where I was supposed to be. There were names that had learned to ask for me directly, not because I was visible, but because I was consistent. That is a different kind of recognition. It does not come with attention. It comes with expectation. There is a strange kind of loneliness in being trusted with things that can cost lives, then going home to people who think you do paperwork. That gap had existed for years, and that morning, it was about to become impossible to ignore. What made it sharper was the part no one had connected yet. Daniel had already benefited from work he never knew came from me. A delayed movement recommendation, one that had adjusted timing just enough to avoid a problem no one had wanted to name out loud. I had not signed it in a way that would have made it obvious. I had not stood in front of anyone to explain it. But it had been there, shaping decisions that affected people like him. And now, he had removed me from the part of the day that everyone could see, without realizing that the part no one could see had already accounted for me. The scale of the mistake was no longer personal. It was structural. The memorial was for the public. The room behind it was for the people who had to decide what happened next. My name was not on the first list. It was already printed on the second. Have you ever held something important quietly enough that people mistook your silence for having nothing at all? The memorial itself was brief, formal, and exactly as controlled as Daniel would have wanted it. From where I stood near the side entrance, kept close enough that a staff member could find me if necessary, but still outside the main room, I could hear the rhythm of it through the walls and the opening of doors. The low murmur of people settling into seats, the pause that comes before official remarks, the careful cadence of names and service dates spoken aloud with the right amount of gravity. No one inside was shouting. No one was improvising. It was a clean, military remembrance, the kind designed to hold grief in a straight line. Through the narrow gap of the side doorway, I caught glimpses of Daniel in the place that fit him best. Visible, composed, occupying his role without friction. My mother and father sat in the family section, exactly where they were supposed to be in the version of the morning they had arranged. Everything was moving according to the story Daniel preferred. The one where the right people were present, the room looked orderly, and nothing awkward had to be explained. I stayed where I was and listened. I did not feel victorious, or hurt in some dramatic way, or even surprised anymore. What I felt was older than that, a kind of fatigue that settles in when people only recognize your existence after someone else with enough authority says your name out loud. The ceremony ended the way these things usually do, with chairs shifting, voices lowering, and the visible part of the morning beginning to dissolve. Public guests started separating from command personnel. Families turned toward one set of exits, while staff redirected the people assigned to the next phase toward the rooms behind the hall. That was when the rhythm changed. I could not see Major General Holt yet, but I knew the moment he entered the transition space because everything around him tightened. Conversations shortened, steps quickened, instructions became more precise. Then I heard his voice, low and direct. "Where is Reid?" An aide answered too quickly, assuming the obvious. "Captain Reid is right here, sir." There was a brief pause, the kind that makes the people standing closest to it instinctively stop moving. Then Holt spoke again, clear enough for more than one person to hear. "Lennox Reid." That was the moment the title of the day finally caught up with reality. Not in the middle of the memorial itself, not in some theatrical interruption, but in the exact place where visibility began handing itself over to consequence. I heard Daniel answer before I saw him. He was trying to sound useful, controlled, still in possession of the room. "Sir, she wasn't attending the service." Another pause. Longer this time. Then Holt asked, in the calmest tone possible, "Wasn't attending, or wasn't allowed in?" That line reached farther than a raised voice ever could have. The people nearest him heard it. Then the people behind them sensed enough to go quiet. Daniel had been pushed into the one position he had spent the entire morning avoiding. Not private embarrassment, public clarification. Holt did not let the moment pass. "She's assigned to the review." His next sentence landed harder. "She should have been processed before family seating was even discussed." And then the one that finished it. "You left the one person I specifically asked for standing outside?" No one around them could pretend this was a family misunderstanding anymore. My mother had probably imagined the morning would stay clean so long as no one asked direct questions. Now, people were looking toward the family section, and she knew it. I did not need to see her face to know what that would do to her. My father would have understood the shift even faster. This was no longer awkward domestic business. It was a professional failure, witnessed inside a chain of command he respected too much to dismiss. That was the humiliation of it. Not just that they had excluded me, but that the exclusion had been dragged into the open, where rank, process, and reputation could see it clearly. I stood very still by the side entrance while my name moved through the room without me. The strange thing was that it did not feel like satisfaction. It felt like confirmation. I had known, at some point, it would take someone outside the family to force the truth into the open. A moment later, the door opened wide, and the same aide stepped out, scanning only once before he saw me. His posture shifted immediately. "Ms. Reid, General Holt needs you in the review room, now." He did not say I could come in. He said he needed me. If the same room that ignored you suddenly stopped and asked for you by name, would that feel like relief or proof? I followed the aide inside without rushing, without trying to match the urgency that had suddenly formed around my name. The shift in the room was immediate, but not dramatic. People did not stop what they were doing in a visible way. They adjusted. Conversations shortened. Space opened where there had not been space a moment before. It was the kind of movement that only happens when people recognize someone's role before they fully recognize the person. Staff who had not looked twice at me outside now stepped aside without needing to be told. The door closed behind me, and the noise from the public side of the building disappeared. Daniel turned when I entered. Not the quick glance from earlier, not the practiced half-acknowledgement he used in front of other people. This time, he actually turned, fully, like he was seeing me in a context he had not prepared for. My mother's eyes followed a second later. It was the first time that morning she looked at me without immediately placing me somewhere smaller. My father's expression did not change quickly, but it settled into something more rigid, the way it does when a man realizes the situation in front of him carries more weight than he expected. Major General Holt did not raise his voice or extend the moment. He simply continued as if the missing piece had been placed back where it belonged. "Ms. Reid is assigned to threat integration for this review." He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at the room, because the room was who needed to hear it. "She has been tracking the sequence we are discussing for the last 6 months." The words were plain, almost understated, but they landed differently now that I was standing inside. Holt continued without pause. "The August movement hold came from her assessment." There was a slight shift in the posture of a few officers near the table, the kind of reaction that does not show on the surface, but changes how people listen. Holt did not embellish. He did not build me into something larger than the work itself. He just placed the facts where they could not be ignored. 3 adjustments this command acted on came from Ms. Reid's desk. He let that sit for a moment before adding the line that closed the distance between my work and Daniel's reality. "One of them kept your unit from moving into compromised timing." Daniel did not speak. He did not need to. The connection had already been made, not loudly, not with any spectacle, but in a way that could not be undone. Holt turned slightly, his attention narrowing just enough to shift the pressure. "Who signed family access?" Daniel answered because there was no one else who could. Holt listened, then responded with a single word. "Noted." It was quiet. It was controlled. And in that environment, it was enough. My mother heard everything that had just been said, not filtered through conversation, not softened by explanation, but delivered directly from someone she could not dismiss. My father stood a little straighter, not out of pride, but because the structure he respected had just corrected him without asking permission. I did not explain anything. I did not add to what Holt had said. When he asked for confirmation, I gave it. When he moved forward, I moved with the discussion. That was all. Some people do not believe what you carry until someone with more status says it out loud in a room they respect. The room adjusted quickly after that. Not because I had proven anything in that moment, but because the system had already decided where I belonged. By the time the review staging settled into its next phase, Daniel approached me at the edge of the space, his voice lower now, stripped of the confidence he had carried earlier. "How long have you been in that chain?" I looked at him for a second, not to challenge him, not to explain, just to answer. "Long enough that you've already followed my work." If someone discovered your quiet work had protected them before they ever respected you, how would they live with that? We did not stay in the room long after that exchange. There was no scene, no raised voices, no attempt to settle anything in front of people who were already moving on to the work that mattered. The shift had already happened where it needed to. What followed was quieter. The kind of conversation that only happens when there is no audience left to perform for. I stepped out toward the side parking area behind the hall, where the air felt colder and the noise from inside faded into something distant. A few vehicles were parked along the edge, and the flag near the walkway moved slowly in the wind. Daniel was already there, standing a few feet away as if he had been trying to decide whether to leave or wait. When he saw me, he straightened slightly. Not with confidence, but with the reflex of someone who still wanted to control how he was seen. For a second, he did not say anything. Then he chose the wrong place to start. "You could have told us." It was not an apology. It was a way to move the responsibility somewhere else, to soften what had happened by suggesting it could have been avoided if I had acted differently. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "You never asked." He looked at me, trying to find a way around that, but there was none. "You didn't leave me out by accident." I continued, steady, without pushing the words harder than they needed to be. "You kept calling it respect when it was convenience." That landed in the space between us without any need for emphasis. He shifted his weight slightly, the first sign that he understood this was not something he could explain away. The part that mattered most was not the gate, not the list, not the moment at the entrance. The gate wasn't the worst part. I said it plainly. Watching all of you treat it like normal was. That was where the real damage had been. Not in one decision, but in how easily everyone had agreed with it. Daniel did not interrupt this time. He was starting to connect things that had not seemed related before. The adjustments, the timing changes, the decisions that had affected his unit without him ever asking where they came from. This was no longer just about what he had done as a brother. It was about what he had failed to recognize as an officer. I could see that realization settling in, not all at once, but enough to change how he stood there. He did not ask for validation. He did not try to correct the past in a single sentence. He just said one thing, almost to himself. "General Holt knew your name." I met his gaze for a moment, then answered without adding anything more. "Yes." That was enough. When someone finally speaks to you with respect, do you feel seen or only tired that it took witnesses? 2 weeks later, everything had returned to the kind of routine that does not leave room for reflection unless you force it. The work moved forward the way it always does, quietly, with timelines that adjust without announcement and decisions that carry weight whether anyone talks about them or not. I was back in the same rooms, the same rhythm, the same expectation that when something needed to be understood clearly, it would be brought to me without hesitation. Nothing about that part had changed. What had changed was what I allowed to reach me from outside of it. Daniel reached out in the middle of a workday, not urgently, not dramatically, but with enough weight in the timing to make it clear this was not casual. When I answered, his voice was steadier than it had been in the parking lot, but it was missing something it used to carry. Not confidence. Assumption. "I need your help." He did not start with anything else. Not an acknowledgement, not a correction, not even an attempt to revisit what had happened. Just the need, placed directly where he expected it would be answered. He explained enough for me to understand the shape of the problem. A planning issue that had shifted out of alignment. A gap in assessment that was starting to show in the timeline. Something that required context he did not have clean access to. It was the kind of situation that could have been handled smoothly if he had the right read at the right time. He did not, and he knew where to get it. I let him finish, then answered without raising my voice or extending the moment. "Use your chain." There was a pause on the line, brief but heavy. "You made it clear I wasn't part of the room." I continued, keeping my tone even. "I'm not stepping into a gap you created just because it finally reached you." I did not say anything else. I did not need to. The outcome was already set. He would move forward with what he had, which was less than what he needed. The briefing would reflect that. The timeline would shift. It would not collapse, but it would show strain. And the people above him would see it without anyone needing to explain why. Major General Holt would not adjust that for him. He would let it stand. That was enough. I did not have to damage anything. I only had to stop protecting it. Later that evening, my phone lit up again with my mother's name. I watched it ring, knowing what would come with it before I answered. "He's under a lot of pressure," she would say. I did not pick up. I let it ring until it stopped, then set the phone back down. Some things do not change. The difference is whether you keep stepping back into them. If someone only came back when your value became useful to them, what would you still owe that history? The next morning started the way most of my mornings do. Early, quiet, and already in motion before the rest of the day has fully caught up. The secure room was the same as it had always been. No windows, low hum from the equipment, screens already waiting with information that would not pause just because anything personal had shifted. I set my things down, logged in, and moved through the first layers of data without thinking about it too much. The work did not need me to feel anything about it. It only needed me to be accurate. That part had never changed. What had changed was something smaller on the surface, but heavier underneath. I was no longer standing outside of anything, waiting to see if I would be acknowledged. I was already where I was supposed to be. A new calendar notification appeared at the top of my screen. Simple, direct, and exactly where it should be. Lennox Reid, lead analyst. No adjustment, no qualifier, no space left for interpretation. I looked at it for a few seconds, not with surprise, but with a kind of stillness that comes when something finally aligns without resistance. Then I opened the attached documents and began reviewing the material for the next briefing. There were no doors to check, no lists to scan, no version of the day where I had to wonder if I would be included. I did not need to prove I belonged there. I had stopped letting anyone else decide whether I did. Maybe the hardest part isn't being erased once. It's deciding whether you still wait to be invited back at all.